I once believed that the most dangerous place I would ever step foot on was the scorched sand of Iraq, where mortars thundered through the night sky and every shadow on a road could hide an improvised bomb. I was wrong. Danger did not remain overseas. It followed me home and wore the familiar faces of my family. My name is Hannah Reynolds. I am 28 years old, and only a few months ago, I completed 2 deployments overseas with the Army. I came home to Charleston, South Carolina, carrying scars both visible and hidden. I thought home would offer peace, but what awaited me was a battleground far crueler than I had imagined. When I stepped off the Greyhound bus at the Charleston station that humid afternoon, the air smelled of salt from the Atlantic and gasoline from the traffic pushing down Meeting Street. I carried only a duffel bag and a folder of discharge papers. My uniform was pressed but already clung to my back with sweat. I scanned the parking lot, searching for my mother's familiar sedan, hoping for a smile, for open arms, for the warmth I had dreamed about during endless desert nights. Instead, I found her waiting alone, frail against the steering wheel, her face pale and her hands trembling on the dash. She hugged me quickly but weakly. The embrace felt more like a warning than a welcome. My stepfather Rick did not come. Neither did my stepbrother Ethan. My mother explained that Rick had a meeting at the VFW hall and Ethan was busy with friends. Her tone carried apology but also fear. I told myself not to judge. I was exhausted and at least she had come. The ride home through Charleston's narrow oak-lined streets should have calmed me. Instead, my mother's silence pressed on me harder than any sandstorm overseas. She finally whispered that her heart condition had worsened and that the medications were expensive. She admitted she had called me because she did not know what else to do. She needed me here, she said, even if it meant giving up the little independence I had fought for after the Army. I reached over, squeezed her hand, and promised I would stay for a while. I thought sacrifice for family was natural. I had no idea the cost would nearly destroy me. The Reynolds house stood in an old neighborhood north of King Street. Its paint-peeled shutters hung crooked and the porch sagged as if exhausted from years of shouting behind closed doors. As I carried my duffel bag up the steps, the smell of stale beer hit me before the door even opened. Inside the living room sat Ethan slouched on the couch with a can already open, though the sun had not yet set. His eyes narrowed at me, scanning my uniform with disdain rather than pride. Rick emerged from the kitchen holding another can. His hair was grayer than I remembered, but his shoulders were still broad from years in the Marines. His face, however, carried none of the discipline I associated with soldiers. Instead, it carried resentment. "Welcome home," he muttered flatly, then added that dinner was at 7 and he expected me to contribute my share. He did not ask about Iraq. He did not ask if I was all right. He only asked about my Army pension. That first evening told me everything, though I refused to believe it at the time. Dinner was stiff. Rick spoke about bills and how the roof needed repairs. He pointed at me with his fork and said my benefits would cover more than enough. Ethan smirked and asked if I had killed anyone. My mother's fork trembled against her plate, but she said nothing. I swallowed my anger and answered none of his questions. I told myself it was only a rough first night. After all, they were family. But as the cicadas screamed outside the kitchen window and Ethan's laughter echoed through the hallway, I realized the battlefield had only changed uniforms. That night in the room I had left at 18, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. The house creaked with footsteps and muffled arguments. My chest tightened as memories from the desert returned. Explosions, screams, the faces of friends who did not come back. I pressed my palms against my eyes and tried to breathe through the panic. I thought I had left the war behind, but the war had followed me. The next morning, Rick banged on my door before sunrise. He demanded I come downstairs to go over finances. He laid out a pile of bills and then pushed a form toward me asking for direct deposit of my veteran benefits into his account. He claimed it was easier for the household. I told him firmly I would not. His jaw tightened and his eyes darkened. He leaned close and whispered that in this house I followed his rules. My mother hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands, whispering at us to stop. Ethan sat on the stairs, chuckling as if he had already won something. I realized then that this was not a homecoming. It was captivity. Over the next week, the pattern deepened. Ethan mocked me in front of neighbors, calling me a failed soldier. Rick accused me of selfishness for keeping my money. My mother cried at night behind her bedroom door. I found bottles hidden under Ethan's mattress and receipts for gambling in Rick's jacket pocket. Every discovery cut away the illusion that family meant safety. I began to keep a journal hidden inside my duffel bag, writing down everything that happened in case one day I needed proof. Each entry felt like loading a round into a chamber. I had no idea when I would need to fire, but I knew the day was coming. Still, there were moments when I wanted desperately to believe change was possible. One morning, I watched Rick carefully stir sugar into my mother's tea. His voice was gentle, almost loving. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe stress had only made him harsh. Maybe I could help. But that night, he slammed the door after losing money at the VFW hall and hurled curses at her until she collapsed in tears. Hope evaporated into ash. I returned to my room, dropped to the floor, and began push-ups until my arms burned. Each rep was a vow. I would not surrender to them. I had faced worse in foreign lands. I could face this. What I did not know was that Ethan had already begun plotting. He could not forgive me for standing taller than him, for wearing a uniform he never earned, for drawing respect from strangers when he inspired only pity. In his mind, I was not his sister. I was competition that needed to be crushed. The stage was set, though I could not yet see it. The storm was gathering above Charleston's humid skies, and soon it would break with a violence no sandstorm could match. The second night home confirmed what my instincts had already warned. I awoke to the sound of raised voices downstairs, the kind that carried through old wooden walls and rattled picture frames. Rick's voice was sharp. Ethan slurred, and my mother's softer cries rose and fell beneath theirs like a weak violin against drums. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, the familiar surge of adrenaline washing over me the same way it had in Iraq when mortars fell too close. My training told me to scan, to locate, to react, but this was not a battlefield where I could call for backup. This was home, and here silence was the only armor. I pressed my back to the wall and listened, every muscle tensed. The argument ended with the crash of glass and my mother's muffled sobs. Then silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I lay awake until dawn, my chest tight, my mind replaying every sound. The nightmares followed when I finally drifted off. I saw flashes of sand and smoke, only to wake to the suffocating heat of my old bedroom walls painted pale blue, but chipped at the corners posters from my teenage years, still hanging like relics of a life that no longer fit. In the morning, I forced myself to act normal. My mother greeted me at the stove with a shaky smile, her eyes red and swollen. Ethan stumbled in late unshaven, his smirk already forming as he reached for a beer, though the sun had barely risen. Rick read the paper like a man in command, ignoring the silence except to bark orders. That breakfast felt less like a family meal and more like a performance where I was expected to play the obedient daughter. The smell of bacon should have comforted me, but instead it twisted my stomach. Ethan looked at me across the table, his grin lazy, and asked again if I had killed anyone overseas. His tone was mocking, daring me to admit something he could twist into a joke. I ignored him, sipping coffee instead. Rick lowered the newspaper and demanded an answer. He said if taxpayers had paid for me to wear a uniform, the least I could do was admit what I had done. My mother whispered at him to stop, but he silenced her with a glare. My hands tightened on the mug, heat searing my palms, but I refused to respond. In the army, silence could be a weapon, and in that kitchen, silence was my shield. Ethan laughed, satisfied he had made me uncomfortable. Rick muttered that soldiers without obedience were worthless. My mother busied herself at the sink, her shoulders shaking. I swallowed my rage and excused myself. Upstairs, I shut my door and leaned against it, breathing hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to break something, to prove I was not weak. Instead, I dropped to the carpet and began push-ups until my arms shook. When the burn grew unbearable, I rolled into planks, then into squats, each rep a rebellion against their control. My body remembered discipline, and if nothing else, I would not let them take that from me. Nights became the hardest. I would hear footsteps outside my door, lingering too long before moving on. Sometimes I woke to find my duffel bag slightly unzipped, my cash lighter by a few bills. I confronted my mother quietly, but she looked away, murmuring that maybe I had misplaced it. Her silence was more painful than theft. She had learned to survive by pretending nothing happened, and she expected me to do the same. But I had not survived war to surrender to fear in my own home. One evening, I returned from a short walk to find my bedroom door locked from the outside. My stomach dropped. I rattled the knob and called out. Rick appeared from the hallway with a smirk and said it must have jammed. He unlocked it casually as if nothing were wrong. But I knew better. It was not a jam, it was a message. You are not free here. That night, I barely slept. I kept a chair wedged against the door and my combat knife under the pillow. The next morning, Rick acted as though nothing had happened, asking if I had considered turning over my direct deposit to him. I told him no. His smile did not reach his eyes. Ethan watched the exchange with glee, as though waiting for me to crack. Emotional tension inside me rose and fell like waves. Some days I convinced myself I could endure it. Other days I felt crushed by the weight of their control. Yet there were small moments when hope flickered, cruel as they were. One Sunday, Rick brewed tea for my mother and spoke to her gently about her medication schedule. Ethan remained silent during breakfast, even cracking a joke that made her laugh weakly. For a heartbeat, I allowed myself to imagine this family could change. That evening, the illusion shattered. Rick accused me of disrespect for not handing over my phone. He demanded to see my messages. When I refused, he slammed his hand on the table so hard the cups rattled. Ethan sneered and called me paranoid. My mother tried to mediate, but Rick's voice boomed until she cowered into her chair. I stared at them both and felt the truth settle in me like cold steel. This was not a family. This was captivity dressed in familiarity. As days passed, the cycle repeated. Insults at meals, demands for money, nights filled with footsteps and whispers. My body remained disciplined, but my heart ached for something normal. I would sit on the porch late at night staring at Charleston's humid skyline, the glow of King Street just visible in the distance. Laughter drifted from bars, the sound of live music carrying on the breeze. Out there, people were living. In here, I was trapped. I knew the storm was building. Each insult another cloud, each demand another flash of lightning. My instincts screamed that a breaking point was near, but I had no idea how violent the storm would become. After a week of suffocating silence and tension, I felt the walls of the Reynolds house pressing against me like a cage. Every creak of the old wood made my skin crawl, every glance from Ethan felt like a challenge, and Rick's voice hammered in my head even when he was not in the room. I needed air. I needed to breathe somewhere that did not reek of beer and resentment. That evening, I decided to walk down King Street, the heart of Charleston, where the city pulsed with life that had nothing to do with my family. The air outside was thick with summer humidity, but it felt cleaner than anything inside that house. As I walked, the city unfolded around me in a mix of old charm and restless energy. Storefronts glowed beneath soft lamps, jazz floated from an open bar, and tourists laughed over plates of shrimp and grits. The sweet smell of roasted pecans mingled with the sharper scent of the harbor breeze. For a moment, I let myself imagine I was just another young woman in Charleston enjoying the night. For a moment, I forgot the constant pressure of home. I slowed near a taco shop where groups of people clustered under strings of lights. At first, I barely noticed him. A man in his late 50s sat slightly apart in a wheelchair, his Marine Corps cap tilted against the glow. His shoulders were broad, though his body carried the stiffness of old injuries. His hands trembled slightly as he maneuvered the wheels. I knew the look immediately, the quiet pride of someone who had given more than most and received little in return. My eyes caught movement beside him. A group of young men lingered too close, their laughter sharp. I listened carefully and recognized the cruel edge in their voices. They were mocking him. One tapped the back of his chair with his sneaker, another blocked his path with a careless step. The veteran lifted his chin steady but strained his jaw, locked with the same pride I had seen in men twice his age overseas. I felt my chest tighten. I could have kept walking like the others who glanced quickly before turning away, but training never leaves you. Without thinking, I moved forward and placed myself between the men and his chair. "That is enough," I said firmly, my voice calm but hard. The men froze, surprised that anyone had stepped in. One of them laughed and muttered that I should mind my own business, but I squared my shoulders the way I had in uniform and told them to back off. "He is leaving. You are done." The oldest narrowed his eyes and spat a curse, but then backed away. The others followed reluctantly, muttering as they disappeared into the crowd. The tension in my chest eased only slightly. I turned to the veteran. He let out a slow breath and looked up at me. His face was weathered-lined by years of service, his eyes clear, though heavy with the weight of time. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying the reluctance of a man unaccustomed to asking for help. "My name is Robert Hayes, Marines retired." I crouched slightly so we met eye to eye. "Hannah Reynolds' army just out." His gaze sharpened at that. "Figures," he said. "Only someone who wore boots would step in." His hands still shook faintly on the wheels. I noticed the strap holding his left leg steady against the footrest and the scar that ran pale across skin that had seen too much. He was steady in spirit, but fragile in body. I asked if he had family nearby. He shook his head. "Most of my people are gone. I get by." The words struck harder than the noise of the street. Loneliness clung to him like a second wound. I offered to walk him to his car. He nodded and pointed to a small sedan parked a block away, fitted with hand controls. As we moved through the crowd, people stared, but no one spoke. It was easier for them to look away. My jaw tightened. The uniform comes off, but the battles never do. At the car, Robert paused before pulling himself into the seat with practiced strength. He folded the chair and set it behind him, then looked at me again. "You did not have to do that." I leaned on the doorframe and met his eyes. "Yes, I did. We do not leave our own." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded a gesture heavier than any salute. The taillights of his sedan disappeared down King Street, leaving me alone under the glow of the lamps. I felt strangely lighter, as if for once I had done something that mattered outside of war. What I did not see was Ethan leaning against a railing across the street, a bottle dangling from his hand, a smirk carved across his face as he watched every move. When I returned to the house that night, the porch light glared like an interrogation lamp. Ethan leaned against the railing, the bottle still dangling from his hand, his grin wide and ugly. "Out playing hero again, Grace?" he sneered, using the name he knew I disliked. "Thought you left all that behind when you quit the army." I stopped at the bottom step, keeping my voice even. "I helped a man who needed it." His laugh was sharp, soaked in alcohol. "A stranger," he spat. "You bleed for him, but not for your own family." The words twisted in my stomach. Behind him, the curtain shifted. I caught a glimpse of my mother's silhouette, bent and frail, and behind her the heavier outline of Rick watching. Ethan stepped closer, the smell of liquor rolling off him, his words slow but poisoned. "You embarrassed me tonight in front of people who know me." My jaw clenched, but I said nothing. He leaned in until his face was inches from mine. His eyes burned with a mix of resentment and challenge. My silence only enraged him further. Finally, I stepped past him and into the house, closing the door firmly behind me. But I knew then that helping Robert Hayes had set something in motion that Ethan would not let rest. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house breathe around me. The old wood groaned like an old ship, the refrigerator hummed, and every sound carried the weight of threat. My mother coughed behind her door. Ethan's voice rose and fell in drunken mutters down the hall. Rick's measured footsteps struck the floor like warning shots. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, the dread heavier than anything I had felt in combat, because this enemy shared my last name. The following morning, the atmosphere was thicker than the Charleston humidity. In the kitchen, Ethan sat at the table, his eyes bloodshot, his grin too wide to be casual. He waited until I poured my coffee before speaking. "So our little soldier thinks she is the city's protector now," he drawled, voice dripping with mockery. Rick looked up from his newspaper, silent but watchful. My mother busied herself at the stove, her hands fumbling as if the weight of the pan might break her. I kept my eyes on my cup, unwilling to feed Ethan's fire, but he pressed on. "You would rather defend some washed-up vet in a chair than stand with your family. That is who you are." My mother's voice trembled. "Ethan, please." He ignored her. "You make us look weak, running around like you are still in uniform. You are not. You are nothing here." His words struck not because I believed them, but because I knew he wanted to push me until I broke. Slowly, I raised my head. "I will always stand with what is right," I said evenly. "Family does not mean covering for cruelty." The words hit him harder than a slap. Rick slammed his hand on the table. "Enough," he barked. His eyes pinned me like a drill sergeant with no mercy. "You do not get to question this family. You are under my roof. You respect my son." The phrase, "my son," carved itself into me deeper than any knife. My mother shrank back, whispering for peace, but no one listened. Later that day, I discovered my phone had been moved, my messages opened, and more cash missing from my bag. When I confronted my mother, she averted her eyes, her silence a surrender. I wanted to shake her, to demand why she let them strip me of dignity piece by piece. But in her face, I saw only fear. That fear bound her tighter than chains. I began to change my habits. I kept what mattered hidden, carried my ID and cash on me at all times, and locked the window from inside. At night, when the house finally quieted, I dropped to the floor and trained in silence. Planks until my arms shook, shadowboxing until sweat soaked the thin carpet. Each move was survival, each breath a reminder that I was not broken. One evening, Ethan pushed my door open without knocking. He leaned on the frame, smirking. "What are you training for, soldier girl? Think you are going to fight us?" His words were not curious. They were a promise of violence to come. I did not answer. I held my stance steady, letting silence be my shield. After a long pause, he laughed and walked away, leaving the door wide open as if to remind me privacy did not exist here. I closed it slowly, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from certainty. The boiling point was coming. I just did not know how soon. The days after King Street unfolded like a tightening noose. Every morning I woke with the same dull ache in my chest, a mix of exhaustion and dread, yet I forced myself to rise because surrender would mean handing them everything. Ethan prowled the house like a wolf circling prey. He no longer limited his taunts to drunken evenings. Now he leaned against the doorway at breakfast and whispered insults low enough that my mother pretended not to hear, but loud enough that each one cut into me. Rick reinforced him not with the sloppy laughter of a drunk, but with the stern weight of a man who believed control was law. Together they pressed down on me, testing how much I would endure before snapping. One night, Ethan waited until the dishes were cleared to throw his challenge across the table. "You made me look weak out there," he hissed, standing in front of strangers like some kind of savior. "You humiliated me." Rick set his glass down slowly and placed a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. "She has no respect, son. She never has." The room felt colder at that moment than the desert nights overseas. My mother sat silent, clutching her fork like a lifeline, eyes down. I wanted to shout at her to see what was happening, to admit it, but her silence was louder than any words. I excused myself, walked upstairs with deliberate calm, and closed my door. But inside, I collapsed against it, breathing hard, the rage twisting in me until it felt like my ribs would crack. I wanted to march back down and let years of training take over, but I thought of my mother's frail shoulders and forced myself still. I knew a confrontation now would only wound her further, so I trained. Push-ups until my arms shook, squats until my legs gave out. My breath ragged, sweat dripping onto the carpet. I kept going because if I stopped, I would drown. Hope came in flashes, cruel but irresistible. One evening, Rick brewed tea for my mother and even carried the cup to her chair. His voice softened, his eyes almost tender. For a moment, I thought maybe the war inside these walls could end, that maybe he too remembered honor. But later that same night, I found him rifling through my bag. When I stepped into the kitchen, he straightened, holding my cash between his fingers as though it were his by right. "Let him be," he said coldly when I demanded he put it back. "He is family. You need to learn your place." Ethan smirked from the corner, stuffing the bills into his pocket. My blood boiled, but I clenched my fists and said nothing. Picking this fight would have left my mother in tears again, and I could not do that to her. So I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. Upstairs, I locked my door and pressed my forehead against the cool wood. My body ached for release, for combat, for action, but my mind knew patience was the only weapon left. The storm was no longer brewing. It was circling closer, waiting for a spark to ignite it. The house became a place where time stretched painfully, every hour marked by footsteps in the hallway and the creak of doors that never seemed fully shut. I learned to move silently, to keep my important things hidden, and to guard every word I spoke. But even silence became ammunition. Ethan twisted it into defiance, mocking me for never answering his questions, accusing me of plotting against him. Rick encouraged the narrative. At the dinner table, he spoke as if I were a child again, demanding obedience and money, his voice carrying the weight of false authority. Each meal felt less like family and more like interrogation. The few moments of calm carried their own cruelty. One Sunday morning, the kitchen filled with the smell of pancakes. My mother, hopeful for once, smiled as she served plates. For nearly half an hour, Ethan said nothing, chewing quietly, even cracking a joke that made her laugh nervously. Rick nodded approvingly, sipping coffee as though the tension of the past weeks had vanished. For a fragile moment, I let myself believe that maybe we had turned a corner. I let myself breathe. That night, Ethan slammed into my room without knocking. He leaned on the frame with that smirk and asked what I was training for. His eyes moved across the floor, where sweat still marked the carpet from my push-ups and planks. "Think you are going to fight us?" he sneered. The words carried more than curiosity. They carried threat. My silence only seemed to feed him. He laughed, left the door wide open, and walked away. I closed it slowly, my hands trembling not from fear but from certainty. The brief illusion of family peace had shattered. The storm was not gone. It had only paused to gather strength. Days blurred together, arguments spilling from the kitchen, slammed doors echoing through the night. Rick grew bolder with his demands. He told me again to hand over part of my army savings to support the household. He said it was my duty as part of the family. I refused. His eyes hardened into stone. He accused me of arrogance, of thinking I was better than them because I had worn a uniform. Ethan echoed him, sneering that soldiers without orders were nothing. My mother tried to soothe, whispering that I should give them a little money to keep the peace. Her words cut deeper than Ethan's insults. She had given up so long ago, she did not even see the chains she wore. I wanted to shout at her to open her eyes, but the fear in her face silenced me. I realized then that survival in this house was not about peace. It was about control. They would push until I broke or surrendered. I promised myself I would do neither. At night, I pressed my palms to the floor and trained harder, faster until my lungs burned and my muscles ached. Each rep was a prayer and a vow. I will not bend. I will not let them own me. Yet the more I resisted quietly, the more I felt the pressure mounting. I knew Ethan was circling closer, waiting for the chance to strike. I just did not know when or where the breaking point would come. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a storm cloud heavy with charge, waiting for the lightning strike. Every corner of the house seemed to hum with tension. Even small sounds, the clatter of dishes in the sink or the creak of the porch, felt amplified, as if warning me that something was coming. Ethan's eyes followed me constantly. When he was drunk, his smirk stretched wider. When he was sober, his silence was worse. Rick moved like a shadow of authority behind him, reinforcing his every sneer. My mother sat in her chair, coughing into a handkerchief, shrinking smaller each day as if her body mirrored her spirit. I tried to anchor myself with routine. I cooked simple meals for her, made sure she took her medicine, kept the house from collapsing into filth. For every small kindness I offered, Ethan countered with mockery. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, rifling through my duffel bag. When I asked what he was doing, he held up a folded stack of bills and grinned. "Just borrowing," he said. "Soldiers do not need money when they have honor right." He shoved the cash into his pocket as if daring me to stop him. I stepped forward, voice sharp, telling him to put it back. For a heartbeat, I thought he might. Then Rick appeared in the doorway, looming, eyes cold. "Let him be," Rick ordered. "He is family. You need to learn your place." The phrase landed like a blow. I clenched my fists but forced myself still. Picking a fight here would mean nothing but pain for my mother. Ethan sauntered out with my money, his laughter echoing. Rick lingered just long enough to let his authority hang heavy in the room before leaving. I stood alone in the kitchen, chest heaving, rage burning hotter than the desert sun. That night, I did not sleep. I dropped to the floor and trained until my muscles screamed for mercy. Push-ups, plank squats, shadow punches each one, a defiance against surrender. Sweat soaked the carpet. My arms trembled, but I kept going. I was not training for fitness. I was training for survival. Deep down, I knew the breaking point was no longer far. One Saturday evening, the storm edged closer. My mother had dozed off in her chair, a blanket pulled to her chin, while I sat at the dining table sipping lukewarm coffee. The house was quiet for once. Then Ethan stumbled in, reeking of alcohol, his voice thick with rage. "You think you are better than me," he slurred. "You think helping some broken Marine makes you a hero. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You made me look weak." I rose slowly, steadying my breath. "You made yourself look weak," I answered. The words cut through the air like broken glass. Ethan's face twisted, his body trembling with fury. Rick entered behind him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "She does not respect us, son," he said. "She never has." In that moment, the truth lay bare in front of me. This was not a home. It was a battlefield. And the war inside these walls was only waiting for the right spark to ignite. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind of evening that should have been ordinary, the kind when neighbors bought milk, when the streets of Charleston glowed with street lamps, and the sound of laughter drifted from the bars along Meeting Street. But ordinary nights have a way of turning into battlefields. My mother had asked me to pick up milk and bread. I agreed, grateful for any reason to step outside the suffocating house. The convenience store on Meeting Street was quiet, its fluorescent lights humming overhead. The air smelled of coffee grounds and detergent. I walked the narrow aisle, selecting a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, letting the normalcy soothe me for a fragile moment. As I turned toward the counter, my eyes caught movement near the coolers. Robert Hayes sat in his chair, a bag of groceries balanced on his lap, his Marine Corps cap low over his brow. I felt a flicker of warmth at the sight of him. At least here was someone who understood. I started to walk over when the door clanged open behind me. Ethan's voice, slurred but sharp, sliced through the hum of the store. "Well, look at this. Our little soldier girl and her new crippled friend." My stomach dropped. Ethan was not alone. Two of his drinking buddies followed him inside, their eyes glassy, their movements restless. The cashier froze, eyes darting nervously between us. Robert looked up, his jaw tightening, but he did not speak. Ethan swaggered forward, smirking. "You embarrassed me once," he said loud enough for the whole store to hear. "You stood in front of strangers like I was nothing, but not tonight." His hand brushed the edge of his jacket, and before I could react, the glint of metal appeared. A knife long enough to gleam under the fluorescent lights rested loosely in his grip. My breath caught my pulse, hammering in my ears. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then everything moved at once. Ethan lunged, the blade flashing. Instinct took over. I stepped in front of Robert. Arms raised my body, remembering every drill, every training exercise. The first strike sliced across my side, white-hot pain blooming as blood welled. The second jab cut into my arm, sending shock through my muscles. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, each one landing like fire. I staggered but did not move from my place. Robert shouted my name, his voice breaking, but I could not step aside. I had sworn never to leave anyone behind. The eighth strike came with a kick, Ethan's boot slamming into my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. I hit the shelves, bread and cereal crashing down around me. My vision blurred, but I forced myself up, body screaming in protest. The 9th, 10th, 11th, each thrust faster, more desperate, tearing through the haze of pain. The world shrank to the narrow aisle. The glint of steel and the pounding of my heart. I heard the cashier cry out someone fumbling with a phone, but it was distant, muffled, as though underwater. I staggered back against the cooler, my hands slick with blood, my knees threatening to give. Ethan's eyes were wild, spit flying from his mouth as he shouted that I was nothing, that I would never rise above him. But even as my body failed, my spirit held. I forced myself forward again, placing my body between Robert and the blade. My voice cracked but carried. "Somebody call the police. Call them now." The knife glinted again as Ethan raised it above his head, his chest heaving, his words broken by fury. "You are not better than me. You never were." His friends circled nervously, their courage fading as they realized how far he had gone, but none stepped forward to stop him. My knees buckled the floor, slick beneath me, the hum of the lights buzzing louder in my ears. Yet even through the haze, I forced my arms wide, shielding Robert, who sat trembling behind me. His voice cracked with desperation. "Hannah, please move. You cannot take another hit." I turned my head just enough to see him and whispered hoarsely, "We never leave our own." Ethan snarled, lunging again. I twisted the blade, cutting across my shoulder instead of my chest. Pain shot through me, blinding and sharp, but training kept me on my feet. I slammed my elbow into his arm, forcing the knife sideways. He cursed and struck again, but this time, Robert threw a can of soup from his lap, hitting Ethan's temple and staggering him. It bought only a second, but a second was all I needed. I shoved Ethan back with the last of my strength. The impact sent us both crashing into the display of chips bags spilling across the tile like fallen leaves. His knife clattered from his hand. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then chaos returned. Ethan scrambled his hands, grasping for the blade. I lunged, my own blood streaking the floor, and kicked it out of reach. One of his friends finally shouted enough, grabbing his arm, but Ethan roared and shoved him aside, spittle flying from his mouth. His eyes burned with hatred, fixed on me alone. The sound of sirens pierced the night air outside, faint but growing. Relief surged through me, though my body was collapsing. I could barely lift my arms, barely keep my eyes open. The cashier yelled that police were coming. Ethan's fury faltered, fear flashing in his eyes, but then he spat down at me. "This is not over." He turned and bolted his friends, stumbling after him. The door slammed open as they vanished into the humid Charleston night. My knees gave way. I fell to the floor, the world spinning, the ceiling lights blurring into streaks. Robert's voice shouted somewhere above me, distant but insistent. "Stay with me, Hannah. Stay awake." His hands pressed against my wounds, his own body trembling. I tried to speak, but blood filled my mouth, choking the words. My vision darkened at the edges. I thought of the desert nights when I had promised fallen friends I would carry them home. Now I wondered if anyone would carry me. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed through the store windows. Boots thundered in, voices shouted. A paramedic knelt beside me, her hands firm but gentle, calling out vitals. "Stay with us, soldier. Stay awake." I wanted to answer, to tell her I was no longer a soldier, just a daughter who had come home to the wrong war, but the words dissolved before they left my lips. As the gurney wheels rattled and the mask pressed against my face, I let my eyes close. In the last fading moment, I thought of my mother sitting alone at home, unaware that her son had turned the night into blood. I thought of Rick, and I knew the lies would already be forming on his tongue. Then, everything went dark. The world returned in fragments, sounds before shapes, light before clarity. A steady beeping echoed near my ear, sharp and rhythmic. The smell of antiseptic filled my nose, clean but suffocating. I tried to move, and pain exploded through my chest, my arm, my side. A groan slipped out before I could stop it. Someone leaned over me, a nurse in scrubs, her voice calm but firm. "You are safe, Hannah. You are at MUSC Health. Do not try to move." My throat burned, my mouth dry as sand, but I forced words out. "Robert," the nurse nodded. "He is safe. He stayed with you until the ambulance came." Relief coursed through me, weak but real. My body was wrapped in tubes and bandages, a machine breathing steady beside me. I had felt death's edge, but somehow I had been pulled back. I drifted in and out for hours, or maybe days, I could not tell. Every time I surfaced, the pain was there, but so were the whispers. I caught fragments of voices outside my room. Rick's voice, low, smooth, explaining that I had lost control, that I had lunged at Ethan with the knife. Ethan's voice fainter, rehearsing lines about how he tried to stop me. My stomach twisted. Even as I fought for life, they were building their lies. One evening, I woke to see my mother sitting by the bed. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she clutched mine. She whispered that she was glad I was alive, but her gaze darted toward the door as if afraid someone might hear. "Mom," I rasped. "They are lying. You know they are lying." Her lips trembled, but she looked away silent. My chest ached more from her silence than from the wounds. I drifted again, darkness pulling me under nightmares filled with sand and fire. When I woke again, alarms blared. My chest seized the monitor, flatlined hands pressed against me, voices shouting, "Clear!" A jolt of electricity ripped through my body, arching my back, fire racing across my nerves. For a second, the darkness swallowed me completely. Then the beep returned, weak but steady, pulling me back from the edge. I gasped for air, tears slipping from the corners of my eyes. The nurse squeezed my shoulder. "You fought your way back, Hannah. You are not done yet." When the alarms quieted and the staff left me breathing again, I lay staring at the ceiling tiles, each square a reminder that I had nearly disappeared. My body felt heavy, stitched together by hands that worked faster than thought, yet my mind churned. I had faced death overseas, but this was different. This time it had been delivered by the people who carried my last name. The door creaked open and Rick stepped inside. He wore a clean shirt, his hair neatly combed, his expression molded into something between concern and authority. He pulled a chair close to the bed, lowering himself with practiced calm. "You need to rest," he said. "Things got out of hand." My throat tightened. "You mean Ethan tried to kill me?" His eyes narrowed, then softened into false pity. "You were confused. You grabbed the knife first. Ethan only defended himself." The words hung like poison in the air. I tried to push myself up, but pain seared through my side. My voice came out hoarse but sharp. "That is a lie, and you know it." Rick leaned closer, his voice dropping. "The police are already asking questions. You will tell them you lost control. You will tell them Ethan tried to protect Robert. If you do not, things will get worse for your mother." My chest burned, not just from wounds, but from rage. He stood and straightened his shirt, then left as silently as he had entered. Minutes later, my mother appeared eyes wide with fear. She begged me not to argue, begged me to go along, whispering that she could not survive another war inside the house. I squeezed her hand, weak but certain. "Mom, I will not let their lies win." She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks, then slipped out before Rick returned. The following day, a detective came, his notepad ready. Robert Hayes was already in the hallway, insisting to be heard. His voice carried through the door. "That girl saved my life. She never raised that knife. She stood between me and death." I wanted to shout thank you, but the oxygen mask muffled everything. The detective looked at me carefully, then at the bandages covering half my body. "We will need your statement once you are stronger," he said quietly. After he left, I let the relief wash over me. At least the truth had a witness. The days blurred into routine. Nurses changed bandages, checked monitors, spoke gently when pain dragged me close to breaking. At night, the memories returned, the blade flashing, the heat of blood, the weight of betrayal. Sometimes I woke screaming, and Robert was there in the chair by my bed, steady despite his injuries, reminding me that I was not alone. Each morning, I forced myself to breathe deeper, to sit straighter, to reclaim the body that Ethan had tried to shatter. I was not done. I would not be erased. The storm had not ended at that store. It was only beginning, and I knew when I left this hospital, walls would not protect them anymore. When the doctors finally allowed me to sit in a wheelchair and roll toward the hospital window, Charleston spread out beneath me like a painting. The rooftops shimmered under the summer heat, the harbor glowed, and for the first time since the attack, I felt air on my face that was not pumped through a machine. But what caught my attention was not the skyline. It was the crowd gathering outside the hospital gates. At first, I thought it was coincidence, maybe families visiting other patients. Then I saw the flags. American flags, Marine flags, Army banners. Veterans in worn caps and jackets stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces solemn but fierce. Some held signs painted with hurried strokes. "Justice for Hannah. Protect those who protect." The sight froze me. I had not called them. I had not asked anyone to stand for me. Yet here they were, dozens, maybe more, their voices rising in unison as they chanted my name. The nurse pushed me closer to the glass. "You have gone viral," she whispered. My heart pounded. Viral! The word felt unreal. Later that day, Robert wheeled into my room, his chair squeaking against the tile. He held up his phone with trembling hands. "Look," he said, "videos everywhere." He pressed play. The screen showed grainy footage from the convenience store. The angle was shaky, but the truth was clear. Ethan lunging, blade flashing me, stepping between him and Robert. My voice faint but steady. "Somebody call the police." The video had spread across Charleston, then beyond. Local news anchors repeated my name. Commentators debated family loyalty versus justice. Strangers wrote messages of support. Veterans groups posted statements demanding an investigation. My chest tightened as I listened. All my life inside that house, I had been silenced, mocked, told I was nothing. Now the world was hearing me without me saying a word. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, I scrolled through messages on a borrowed tablet. Hundreds of strangers thanking me for standing in front of Robert. Dozens of veterans saying they had felt forgotten until they saw me. Mothers writing that they hoped their daughters would grow with the same courage. Each message lit a small flame inside me, burning against the darkness of Ethan's blade. But beneath the pride lay fear. Rick and Ethan were still free, still whispering lies, still plotting. I knew a storm was building outside the hospital walls. Yet for the first time since coming home, I also knew I was not facing it alone. The following morning, the chanting outside grew louder. The windows shook faintly with the rhythm of voices rising together. I asked a nurse to wheel me closer, and when the glass cleared, I saw the crowd had doubled. Veterans from every branch had gathered, some leaning on canes, others standing tall in faded uniforms that no longer fit but still carried pride. Banners stretched above their heads. "Justice for Hannah. Stand with Robert. Truth over lies." My throat tightened. They were not just here for me. They were here for every veteran who had been forgotten, every soldier who had returned home to battles no one wanted to acknowledge. Reporters clustered near the barricades, cameras pointed at the signs, microphones catching every chant. That evening, local news ran a segment showing my face beside Robert's, replaying the video from the convenience store. The anchor's voice cut clear. "Tonight, Charleston asks whether a woman who stood in front of a blade should be forced into silence by her own family. Calls for justice are growing louder." I could hardly believe it. For so long, Rick and Ethan had controlled the narrative within the house. Now the story belonged to the public, and they could not stop it. Robert visited again, his eyes bright with fire I had not seen before. "They cannot bury this, Hannah," he said firmly. "Too many people are watching." He was right. Social media swarmed with messages, hashtags, spreading, strangers posting their own stories of family betrayal and survival. My name became a rallying cry, but it did not feel like vanity. It felt like a shield raised by thousands of hands. One night, as I drifted near sleep, the nurse whispered that a candlelight vigil had begun outside. Veterans and civilians alike held candles, their light flickering against the humid Charleston night. The sound of Amazing Grace carried faintly through the glass, soft but unyielding. Tears slid down my cheeks as I listened. I had never felt so broken in body, yet so lifted in spirit. For years I had fought alone. Now, even from a hospital bed, I was part of something larger. Ethan and Rick could lie to detectives. They could twist stories within the walls of our house, but they could not silence a city. And I realized then that justice was no longer a private hope. It had become a public demand, and once a community rises, no threat can push it back into silence. 1 week after the attack, when my body was still weak and the bandages still tight across my side, the hospital allowed me to sit outside for the first time. They wheeled me to the front entrance where the air was heavy with heat and the faint smell of salt from the harbor. I expected to find only a few reporters. Instead, I was met by a sea of faces. Veterans lined the steps, some in crisp jackets, others in faded shirts from wars long past. American flags waved gently in the sticky Charleston air. Members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars stood shoulder to shoulder with men from the American Legion, their banners rising above the crowd. For a moment, I could not breathe. These were strangers, yet their eyes locked on me with the weight of family. The nurse whispered that more than 100 had gathered some driving hours just to stand here. At the center of the steps, a man in uniform stepped forward. His posture was straight, his hair silver, his rank clear on his collar. Colonel Thomas Avery. He had served decades, his name familiar to many in Charleston. He looked at me not with pity, but with respect. He raised his voice so the crowd could hear. Hannah Reynolds, when others turned away, you stood in front of a blade to shield a fellow Marine. You carried out the creed that binds us all, no one left behind. We honor you today, not as a victim, but as a soldier who kept the oath even in peace. He reached into his pocket and drew out a challenge coin heavy and etched with the insignia of his unit. He placed it in my hand. The coin was warm from his palm, the words engraved clear. To the shield who stood unbroken. My throat burned, tears blurring the world. The crowd broke into applause, not wild, but steady, the kind that carried reverence. For once, I felt not trapped, not mocked, but seen. A flag was folded by two veterans and handed to me with precision, the same way we honored the fallen. But this time, it was given not in grief, but in recognition that I was still here. My fingers clutched the fabric as though it could hold me upright. Robert sat nearby, tears streaking his face, whispering that justice had already begun. For the first time since stepping off that Greyhound bus, I believed him. The ceremony outside the hospital did not end with speeches. After Colonel Avery's words, the veterans closed ranks around me not as guards, but as witnesses. Their presence sent a message louder than any siren. The lies that Rick and Ethan whispered could no longer stand against the sound of this crowd. Reporters pushed forward with questions, their microphones catching every detail. How did it feel to shield another veteran? Did I believe my family's version of events? What did I want to see happen next? My body ached too much to answer all of them, but I lifted the folded flag in my lap and spoke as clearly as I could. Family should protect, not destroy. The words carried farther than I expected. The crowd cheered, and for once the sound did not frighten me. It lifted me. Later that evening, the vigil continued on the lawn of a nearby church. Candles glowed in the twilight, casting small circles of light that together formed a sea. Veterans sang hymns, civilians stood beside them, strangers clasped hands. When the choir began to sing Amazing Grace again, my chest tightened with the weight of it. I had grown used to fighting alone, to keeping my voice locked inside the walls of that house. Now I was surrounded by voices that refused to let me sink into silence. Robert rolled to my side and leaned close. "You gave us back something tonight," he whispered. "Hope." I stared at the flame of my candle flickering against the dark and realized he was right. Hope was rising not only for me, but for everyone who had been crushed by betrayal and forgotten by family. That night, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the coin Colonel Avery had pressed into my palm. To the shield who stood unbroken, I traced the words again and again until sleep finally came. And for the first time in weeks, the nightmares did not win. The morning of the trial, the air in Charleston felt heavier than usual, as if the whole city held its breath. The courthouse on Broad Street stood tall, its white columns gleaming under the sun. I sat in my wheelchair at the base of those steps, the flag folded in my lap, the coin in my pocket. Reporters swarmed nearby, veterans lined the sidewalks, and strangers who had never met me called my name. I lifted my eyes to the building and felt the weight of what was about to begin. Inside the courtroom, the air was colder, the walls lined with oak, the ceiling high enough to echo. The judge sat stern behind the bench, the seal of South Carolina above him. On the left sat Ethan, his face pale, his suit ill-fitting, his eyes darting nervously. Beside him, Rick sat rigid, whispering into his son's ear, his jaw clenched. My mother sat apart, her hands twisted together, eyes down. On the right sat Robert in his chair, steady despite the tremor in his hands, his Marine cap resting on the table in front of him. I felt his presence like a shield. When the prosecutor rose, silence fell. The video from the convenience store was played on the screen. Grainy, shaky, but undeniable. Ethan lunging knife flashing me stepping between him and Robert, my voice shouting for help. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This is not self-defense. This is attempted murder." Ethan's lawyer tried to spin another story. He claimed I had a violent temper, that I had confronted Ethan with the blade, that my military training had made me reckless. He even suggested Robert was confused, his injuries clouding his memory. Each word struck like another blade, twisting the truth. My chest tightened, my palms damp, but I held my gaze steady. Then Robert wheeled himself forward. His voice cracked but carried. I was there. I watched her stand in front of me. She took every strike meant for me. She never touched that knife. She saved my life. The courtroom stilled. For a moment, even Ethan's lawyer seemed lost for words. When Robert finished his testimony, the room remained silent, the weight of his words echoing louder than any gavel. The prosecutor nodded and called the next witness, the store cashier. His voice shook as he described the night, the way Ethan had stormed in with a knife, the way I had stepped between him and Robert. He admitted he had been terrified, but he had seen clearly who attacked first. Then the surveillance video from the store's security camera was shown. The angle was wider, the footage clearer than the shaky phone recording. Ethan charging the knife, flashing my body shielding Robert, my blood staining the floor. No amount of words could twist what the jury saw with their own eyes. Ethan's lawyer tried once more to argue confusion, tried to paint me as unstable, but each objection sounded weaker. The judge's gavel struck when the shouting grew too loud, reminding everyone that truth was not up for debate. At last, it was my turn. The bailiff wheeled me forward, my body still weak but my voice steady. I told the jury what had happened, how I had gone to the store for milk and bread, how I had seen Robert again, how Ethan had burst in with rage and metal in his hand. I described each strike, the pain, the determination to stand between Robert and death. My voice cracked when I spoke of my mother, of the silence she had chosen, of the lies Rick had tried to press upon me in the hospital. But I did not cry. I lifted the folded flag onto the stand and told them that I had not stood in front of that blade for recognition or for glory. I had stood there because family should protect, not destroy. The words hung heavy, and for once, Ethan could not meet my eyes. Closing arguments came swift. The prosecutor's voice rang with conviction. He told the jury this was not a story of confusion or family squabble. This was an attack born of envy and cruelty. He asked them to deliver the justice the community already demanded. The jury left, and time stretched unbearably. I clutched the coin in my pocket, Robert's hand steady on my shoulder. Then the doors opened. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. A cry broke from my mother's lips, part grief, part release. Ethan's face drained of color. Rick cursed under his breath, fists clenched, but the bailiff stepped between us. The judge declared the sentence. 20 years in state prison with no parole for the first 10. The gavel struck. Justice clear and unshakable. When the sentence was spoken, the air inside the courtroom shifted. The hum of whispers rose, the shuffle of feet followed, and in the midst of it all, I felt the strangest thing. Not triumph. Not joy. Just release. Years of tension, of whispered threats, of doors slammed and lies told in the dark seemed to dissolve with the sound of the gavel. Ethan's smirk had vanished. His eyes darted between the deputies as they led him away in chains, his bravado shriveled into a mask of fear. Rick sat rigid, his face pale, and I realized that the power he had clung to so tightly no longer held. His son was gone. His lies had been stripped bare, and no amount of bluster could undo what the jury had made final. My mother. Margaret clutched my hand as we exited the courthouse. Tears streaked her cheeks, but there was a calm in her shoulders I had not seen in years. For the first time, she walked without her body curled in defense, without her eyes darting to see if Rick watched. She whispered thank you again and again, as though repeating the words might anchor her in this new reality. Outside the courthouse, the scene struck me harder than the verdict itself. Veterans lined the steps. Some held flags, some saluted as I descended slowly with my cane. Civilians stood, two neighbors who once glanced away, now holding signs with my name painted across them. Cameras flashed voices, called questions, but what reached me most was the chant that rose again. Justice for Hannah. Their voices rang through Charleston like a bell. I felt Robert roll forward in his chair beside me. His weathered face lifted proudly as though the verdict had vindicated him too. He had survived, and so had I, and together we had shown that cruelty hidden in shadows could not remain unseen. The days that followed moved in strange rhythm. News reports replayed the trial highlights, my testimony, the video footage. Commentators debated family loyalty versus moral duty, but every time the footage appeared, the truth stood on its own. Letters poured in. Some came from other veterans who told me they saw themselves in my stand. Some came from strangers who admitted they had endured family violence and finally felt seen. Each envelope I opened was a reminder that what had nearly destroyed me was now creating something larger. At home, the silence was different. Rick avoided me, his voice muted, his steps heavier. My mother no longer flinched when he entered a room. She spent more time in the garden, her hands in the soil, her laughter faint, but genuine. At night, I would sit by the window and look at the folded flag on the mantel, the coin beside it, and remember the words spoken on my porch to the shield, who stood unbroken. For years, I had carried scars in silence. Now, those scars spoke louder than any threat Rick or Ethan could wield. One evening, Robert visited. He rolled into the living room, his hands trembling slightly on the wheels, and looked at me with steady eyes. "You gave me more than my life back," he said. "You reminded me that even broken bodies can still stand when someone believes they're worth protecting." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. His gratitude weighed heavier than any medal. He left a worn marine cap on the table, its fabric faded by years of sun. "For you," he said, "you earned it." That night, as I held the cap, the realization struck me. Ethan had taken 7 cuts at my body and tried 3 more, but what he could not cut away was the truth that had finally come into the light. The weeks after the trial carried a rhythm I had never known before. For the first time in years, the house no longer throbbed with constant tension. Ethan was behind bars. Rick's voice carried no authority, and my mother began to breathe freely. She cooked meals without trembling. She hummed softly while folding laundry, and sometimes I caught her standing at the window with a faraway smile, as if imagining a future she had once buried deep inside. I realized then that freedom was not just mine. It belonged to her, too. Charleston itself seemed to change. People who had once turned their faces away in the grocery store now stopped to greet me. Some pressed my hand, some whispered prayers, others simply nodded with quiet respect. One afternoon at the farmer's market, an elderly woman approached with her granddaughter. She introduced herself as the widow of a Korean War veteran. She told me she had watched the footage of me shielding Robert, and she wanted her granddaughter to meet the woman who had shown that courage did not fade when the uniform came off. I bent down, shook the girl's hand, and told her strength comes from choices, not appearances. The girl's smile lit something inside me I had thought long gone. Robert became a regular presence. He insisted on joining me for physical therapy sessions, cracking jokes when the exercises grew painful, reminding me that resilience could carry laughter too. Sometimes he sat in the corner of the room as I taught myself to walk longer distances with the cane. His presence grounded me. He called me soldier even when I protested that I was no longer in the service. Once he said, "Hannah, there are soldiers on every battlefield, but few have the courage to face their own family as the enemy." His words settled deep into my bones. The veterans community did not let my story fade. The local VFW hall invited me to speak. At first I hesitated. I was no polished speaker, but I remembered the faces outside the courthouse, the chance of justice for Hannah, and I knew silence would dishonor what had been done in my name. I stood in front of the gathering, my cane steady in one hand, and told them about fear, about choosing to act when the easier path was retreat, and about the price of standing. The hall was quiet until a man with silver hair and a cane rose and saluted me. Others followed. The weight of that respect nearly buckled my knees, but it also stitched something inside me that had long been torn. Rick remained in the house for a time, but his grip was gone. Neighbors looked at him differently. His authority shrank each time someone mentioned the trial. My mother began talking about selling the property, moving into a smaller place where sunlight reached every corner. For once, I did not argue. I knew this chapter needed to close. Rick left one morning without saying much, carrying a single bag. The silence after the door shut was not heavy. It was liberating. With the space freed, I began thinking of ways to use my pain for purpose. Women from shelters reached out. They asked if I might teach them simple self-defense the way I had once trained in my room while fearing the storm inside the house. I agreed. At first, there were only 3 women in a church basement. We practiced stance balance and the courage to say no with our voices as well as our bodies. Word spread. Soon there were a dozen, then more. Each time I watched a woman walk out with her head higher, I felt as though another piece of my own spirit had been rebuilt. Late one evening, I stood alone in that same basement, the folded flag and the coin placed carefully on a shelf nearby. I whispered to myself, "Justice may roar once, but courage is a choice we make every day." The words echoed in the empty room, and I knew they were true. A year after the trial, I returned quietly to Charleston's Meeting Street. The convenience store where everything had erupted was still there, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the evening air. I stood across the street for a long time, remembering the smell of stale chips and cheap beer, the flash of metal, the sound of Robert's voice crying out my name. The memory pressed against my chest, sharp and heavy, yet I no longer felt trapped in it. I walked closer, cane steady, and noticed a mural painted on the side wall. It showed a woman standing in front of a man in a wheelchair, arms outstretched like a shield. The colors were bold, the lines simple, but the message unmistakable. Across the bottom, someone had painted the words, "Courage does not always wear a uniform." My throat tightened. I had not asked for that image yet. It existed, a symbol carried beyond my scars. Cars slowed as drivers glanced, some honked softly in solidarity. For the first time, I understood that my story belonged not just to me, but to others who needed to see that standing up was possible. Robert joined me that evening, wheeled up beside me with his cap pulled low. He studied the mural, then nodded. "That's us," he said simply. "Not heroes, just people who chose not to step aside." His voice cracked, but he smiled, and in that smile, I saw the weight of survival carried with pride rather than shame. Life did not return to normal because normal had never been safe. Instead, I built something new. My classes at the church basement grew into a regular program. Local shelters began sending women regularly, and sometimes teenage girls arrived with their mothers eager to learn that strength was not only physical, but also a decision to believe they mattered. Each class ended with us standing together repeating words I had once whispered to myself in the dark. "I will not be silenced." Watching them say it aloud stitched my own heart further each time. My mother Margaret blossomed slowly. She planted flowers in bright colors, her laughter growing stronger with each season. She told me once that she felt as if years of weight had lifted when Ethan was taken away and Rick finally vanished. She said the house had turned from a prison into a home. I knew it was true when I heard her humming while cooking, her voice carrying lightly through the halls, where once there had only been shouts. Letters still arrived. Some came from veterans across the country who said my story had reminded them of their own battles at home. Others came from people who had never seen combat but knew the war of silence in their own families. One letter from a teenage boy in Ohio struck me most. He wrote that he had stood up to his abusive father after watching my story on television. He ended with 4 words that I read again and again. "You gave me courage. Not every day was easy." My body still carried pain, my ribs aching when the weather shifted my arms stiff on cold mornings. Nights sometimes brought dreams that jolted me awake, but each scar reminded me not of defeat, but of survival. They told me I was still here, still choosing to stand. On the 2nd anniversary, I returned to Arlington quietly. I carried the folded flag that had been placed in my arms and the coin etched with, "To the shield who stood unbroken." I laid them gently at the grave of a Marine I had once served beside overseas. The November wind stung my cheeks, but I whispered the words that had carried me through "Justice may roar once, but courage is a choice we make every day." I walked away from the rows of headstones knowing that my life was no longer defined by Ethan's knife, by Rick's control, or by the silence of my past. It was defined by what I chose after, by the voices I helped lift, and by the truth that scars can light the path for others.